I used to think dry brushing is trash. In fact, many people still do think it's just for beginners. And it's true that dry brushing is one of the easier techniques, but when you're painting armies, it can get you quite far, quite fast. And this is where Artis Opus and this box right here comes in. You see, I do think that with dry brushing you can get great results fast, but can it also be used to paint a proper display miniature? Byron from Artis Opus thinks yes. So he started working on a display model with dry brushing, sent it to me half done, and I am supposed to finish it. And once done, I'll send it back to him to see if he likes it. Let's see what we are working with. Hi Simon, please find your mini enclosed and some tools to use on it. I'm super excited to see what you do with it. I pushed myself on the quality of the dry brushing, so hopefully you have the best base possible to work your magic on. Okay, feel free to repaint any area of it entirely, the mini or the base. I'll be watching and taking notes. Honestly, I'm quite excited because I haven't seen the mini yet. Maybe I won't touch anything that has been already painted. We'll see. Yeah, this is a bit unwieldy. What is this? Oh wow. Okay, I didn't expect that. Oh wow, okay. Yeah, but anyway, let's get to the miniature. And this should be the miniature, I guess? Oh wow, okay. So luckily for me, there are some places where I can work. Let me just put on my gloves. So for example, the swords, as Byron mentioned, are not painted, the guts are not painted, I assume. So there is a bunch of stuff that needs some work. And funnily enough, like the great unclean one that is already on the Artis Opus YouTube channel is the one miniature that I like the most that has been dry brushed. So this is a hit right in the bullseye. And this is what we are working with. And after inspecting it for a bit, of course, it was time to set up the action plan. If all of this was built just by dry brushing, that's really impressive. If it was like one day or one afternoon, that's a really good start. All of the skin is super smooth, especially if it has been only dry brushed, which apparently it has been. Now, one unfortunate thing about dry brushing is that you can't really get everywhere with your brushes, especially if you are using bigger ones. So for example, on his face, there are certainly parts that haven't been highlighted at all. What I really do like though, is that he really highlighted the shapes of the miniature. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the arms and the belly, these are pretty much just cylinders, right? And the belly is just a sphere. Now, you can make the argument that the head is a sphere as well, and it's not really highlighted properly from what I can see. So what we will do is definitely highlight it a bit more, highlight it, for example, like this, maybe even lighter than that. We'll see. You know, this is just a rough sketch, so don't make any conclusion based on this. We could also highlight the face more, and there is a certain potential to make the eyes glowy. I really like that the horns are quite light, so maybe you don't have to touch them as much. Maybe just a little bit of white, but again, we'll see. We could further emphasize the shapes of this miniature by painting a circular highlight on his belly and on these cylinders. Definitely feel like the hood needs another round of highlights, so let's do that real quick. Funnily enough, I don't have to sketch these non-metallic metal parts because they are sketched for us already. You can see how the reflections are formed from the natural light. So essentially I can just copy them and voila. Yeah, so pretty much I can just sketch it for you real quick. Yeah, this is our rough sketch. This is what we are aiming for. It's gonna be a bit rougher, not as smooth, and a bit different. Let's do it. And so, with a proper plan in mind, I could start painting. First off, I decided to disassemble the model again to have easier access. Since head is the most important part, I started with the green glow in his eyes. Initially, I covered a lot of space with this kinda deep green color. When painting glow effects, the source is the brightest point, and because of that you can't have too much of the lightest paint hitting the surrounding parts. At this point, however, we can paint them. It's just when I get to the lighter colors that I start being more selective. By the way, what you see me do is add yellow and white to make it brighter. If I added only white, it would look like baby poo-poo. But by adding yellow as well, it keeps the final result juicy and saturated. Or another way to make the eyes really pop is to paint a pure white dot and glaze a yellow fluo paint over it. Now remember how I said that perhaps I won't even touch the horns? Well, that was wrong. I did add some very light gray here and there to bring more focus to the head. However, if I was a betting man, I would bet my left ass cheek that Byron won't even notice. But we'll see. I also painted the rest of the face since it hasn't been covered properly in the dry brushing stage. There is nothing too interesting to say, maybe with the exception of the maggots. Certainly, I wanted to put some effort into this mini, but not way too much, because I'm not keeping it. So yeah, I will be sending this miniature back to Byron, and it's also not like this is a competition piece anyway. This means that instead of worrying about every single minor detail, I opted into looking at the big picture. And you'll see how that's reflected in the result later. It's an unfortunate fact that the maggots are right in his face, so I was kinda forced to pick out every detail in this maggot cluster multiple times, because it's the focal point of the mini. When it came to painting these open wounds, I went for warm purple or almost magenta colors. These weren't particularly important, so moving on. I've also chosen pretty similar colors for the tentacles, because it contrasts so nicely with the green skin. Since these aren't as important and you can absolutely afford to make them textured, I decided to wet blend them a little bit. Usually you have to wait for the previous layer to fully dry, but if you don't do that and apply another paint layer over it early enough, you can blend the paints quite nicely without too much effort. This is not like perfect wet blending, but it'll do the trick. Then on top of that, I applied another small highlight so it feels more glossy. Before tackling the body, I wanted to paint something fun, and I can't think of more fun toy than the swords. This might be more of a dagger actually, given the size proportion, but who the f cares? It's sharp, pointy, and goes stabby stabby. Since Nurgle has a thing for copper and bronze for some reason, we'll paint it just like that. When going for bronze or gold or any warm non-metallic metal, I usually start with a dark brown layer. And then it's pretty simple. Remember how I said that we can just copy the reflections that are formed on the mini from the natural light? Well, that's all I did here. I've already talked about that in multiple videos, but copying the reflections like this is the simplest solution. Now, I am saying it's relatively simple, but it's also very time consuming, and most likely you won't get it right on your first try. When you build all the reflections the way that I do, you gotta start covering a lot, and then you cover less and less with lighter and lighter layers. So for the first layer I used medium rust from AK Interactive, then I added a bit of white and yellow, then again, and the final highlight was almost pure white. I always focus on the exposed parts and the edges, because those should get the most light. And again, if you are not sure where to place the reflections yourself, just take a picture of your mini in a black primer and you'll find them. This side of the dagger took me like half an hour to paint, and I recorded all of that. But of course, including the entire thing would be boring, so all of the unedited footage will be on my Patreon. And also, Patreon is a nice way to support this channel. We also have our own Discord community, so if you have a few bucks, check it out. The blade followed the same principles. I wasn't trying to make it extra smooth, but the reflection placement was key to make it credible. By aggressively highlighting the edges, it gives you an impression of sharpness. So even though you could make the argument that Nurgle weapons should be old and rusty, this will sell the non-metallic metal effect even more. After doing some back and forth between the reflections and shades, and even adding some blue in there, I was fairly pleased with the result. Exactly the same process has been done on the other blade. We actually painted most of it on stream, but given that it follows the same principles of finding the reflections and layering, it's not too different from the dagger. What we can do now is start enhancing what Byron painted already. I gotta say, it felt kinda wrong, painting over something my fellow hobbyist already covered, but you know what they say, art doesn't care about your feelings. They do say that, right? Just like in the plan, I made the leather cap lighter. Unlike the Photoshop sketch though, we gotta respect the particular shapes on the Mini, so it makes sense. There are all kinds of folds and crevices which have to be kept darker, as the light doesn't get there. This is actually one of the strengths of dry brushing, because by the nature of the technique, you don't touch the recesses. So adding just some touch-ups on top takes very little time. Actually, when you think about it, I am sure that the dry brushing step saved us a ton of time. I've done the same thing on the arms, and just thinking about painting all these parts from scratch makes me anxious. And since selective dry brushing did highlight all the parts quite nicely, I'm just making them a bit lighter rather than repainting them entirely. So it comes as a no surprise that I only did this for the parts around his face, since, again, I want everything on this Mini to point that direction. So the parts that were further highlighted are both of its arms and the belly. Actually, I added some very minor highlights on the back, but it's really not important, since it's not the focal point and neither are the feet. At least if you are not Quentin Tarantino. You should subscribe for more fetish jokes. At this point, all of the enhancing is done, and that means majority of the dry brushed parts haven't been touched at all. So, as I said, it really saved us a lot of time, and honestly, you wouldn't even know it's been dry brushed without a proper inspection. However, we still gotta paint all the gross parts. Luckily, I don't have to be nearly as precise and neat at this point, so it's not like this was particularly hard, rather it was just kinda boring. Some parts were also definitely more enjoyable than others, so while the sores were a grind, the guts were interesting. What I knew for sure is that I don't wanna bring too much attention to them, so it was a balancing act. The same can be said about the visible fatty tissue, but given the nature of this thing, painting these ugly bits was quite forgiving. After painting the rest of these bits, it was time to make the copper and bronze parts feel more weathered. If I had some kind of magic in a bottle kinda effect available, I would apply a verdigris like that. But because I don't, I simply watered down a turquoise color and selectively applied a wash in the recesses. Now, I did say that we won't further enhance what has been dry brushed already, but I was wrong. Well, sorta. To make the entire thing look more harmonious, I decided to airbrush this deep blue color into shades. It's essential to do this with a very thin filters, so you can make multiple passes if you want, and you have a great control over it. And not only will it make the whole thing feel more harmonious, but also it will make the yellow parts of the skin stand out even more, because of the color contrast. And that's why I heavily focused on the parts around the feet at this point, because I want them to be significantly darker than the arms or the belly. But of course, the shades on every part of the Mini were covered like this, even if just a little bit. Despite the fact I didn't appreciate dry brushing in the past, I gotta admit it made some real heavy lifting here. And in the end, by combining it with more traditional approach, I am very happy with the result. But that's not the end of the story though. I sent the Mini back to Byron, and now you can watch his reaction and his part of the process.
Oh shit.
Right here. So check it out, and see you there.